There's something about a rainy night that makes you want to pull the covers a little tighter, lock the doors, and wonder what's lurking just outside the window. Tonight, we're pulling up the sheets, but pulling back the curtain on true crime cases you were never supposed to hear about. Cases that slipped through the cracks, got buried by bureaucracy, or were simply too disturbing to make headlines. So settle in and let's begin. You're supposed to be the safest with the people that you've known the longest. The ones who grew up in your home. The ones your parents trusted. The ones who've been there since elementary school. Jason Sweeney certainly believed that. He was 16, working full-time, planning his future, and bringing his first real girlfriend home to meet his parents the next day. But instead, he walked into the woods with the people he trusted and never walked out. What happened to Jason wasn't random. It wasn't a stranger, and it wasn't sudden. It was betrayal. Jason Sweeney grew up in Fishtown, Philadelphia. His dad used to joke that their family was like the Beatles, 4 of them, always together. Jason worked for his family's construction business and made $500 a week, and he soon planned to join the Navy. He wasn't a reckless guy. He wasn't spiraling. He had direction. And maybe that's what made him different. Because while Jason was building a future, some of the people around him were quietly destroying theirs. And the resentment didn't happen overnight. It started in elementary school. One thing to know about Jason is that he had several friend groups. He was friends with the smart kids, the quiet kids, the loud kids, and the troublemakers. Jason was just that kind of person. He was never easily influenced by anyone or anything, and his primary goal was just to become a Navy SEAL. But someone he trusted the most was determined to make sure that never happened. Jason's best friend since elementary school was a boy by the name of Edward, or Eddie, Batzig Jr. The two were really close, and some would say they were basically joined at the hip. To give you an idea of how close Jason and Eddie were, their families also knew each other to the point where Eddie's family would invite and pay for Jason to accompany his best friend on trips, and Jason's family would do the same for Eddie. According to Jason's sister, Melissa, Eddie was a staple in the Sweeney household. He would stop by the house to play with Jason, have dinner with the Sweeneys, and hang out with them basically all day every day. Aside from Eddie, Jason was also friends with 2 brothers, Nicholas and Dominique Koya. Dominique was a year older than Jason, Eddie, and Nicholas, but the 4 hung out a lot. Now, the thing with Nicholas and Dominique was that they were loners. They were raised by a single dad, and the 2 brothers would always be together, and the 2 would always be on their own on the outskirts of town. But still, nothing alarming or anything that screamed bad kid behavior, at least not initially. Jason, Eddie, and the Koya brothers remained friends until high school, but that was when that shift started to occur, and for some reason, Eddie was spiraling out of control, and he became a magnet for troublemaking. He spent more time in the presence of police than he did in his own school. And I'm not completely sure what he was up to and why he was constantly in trouble, but if he had to go to court hearings all the time, then it must have been serious to some extent. So in their high school era, Jason, Eddie, and the Koya brothers weren't as close anymore. So it wasn't long before they lost touch and their friendship kind of ended. In the meantime, Jason had plans for his own life. His family ran a construction business, and 16-year-old Jason decided to leave school at the beginning of 2003 and work for that family business. Well, after leaving high school and becoming a full-time employee at the construction business, Jason did reconnect with Eddie and the Koya brothers, but he was heartbroken and disappointed to see that his former friends weren't the same anymore. See, Eddie was already going down a dark path, but now he'd made a home there with Nicholas and Dominique. Jason's core ride-or-die group, who were only 16 or 17, were now heavily involved in hardcore substance and alcohol abuse. This was such a punch in the gut for Jason to hear. Now, Jason seldom used any sort of substances. The furthest he ever went was smoking. But what these 3 boys were doing was something that both Jason and his family were not comfortable or okay with. Neither Jason's parents nor Jason wanted to see the young boy spiral like that. Jason tried to talk his friends into quitting these habits and getting their lives back on track, but this caused even more tension in the group. Eddie, Nicholas, and Dominique were basically just angry at Jason for trying to correct them, and Jason was just helpless against them. Basically, from Jason's perspective, he wanted his old friends back. He genuinely wanted Eddie and the Koya brothers to get their lives together. They were all fast approaching adulthood, and they didn't have any solid plans for the future, whereas Jason did. He had a job, he made $500 a week, and he was making plans of enlisting in the Navy. From the trio's perspective, though, you could sense there was some jealousy, some resentment, and a lot of anger. The trio was jealous of Jason having his life on track despite having left high school early. Things were looking up for Jason. You can clearly see the stark difference between him and the trio. And if you ask me, this could have been them too if they only hadn't derailed their lives like that. Alcohol and substance abuse, it's terrible, but with a rock-solid support system, you can overcome anything, truly. But Eddie and Nicholas and Dominique were in no hurry to do such a thing. They liked the risk, they liked the parties, and they enjoyed that lifestyle. But like it or not, Jason was about to be roped into this mess one way or the other, especially when Eddie, Nick, and Dominique introduced Jason to someone who would change his life forever. From the outside, Jason had it all. A great job, a great future, all of it. But the one thing he didn't have was true love. That is, until 15-year-old Justina Morley came into the picture. But there's a lot to unpack about Justina. See, when she was just 10 years old, she was exposed to the dark world of substances. This was not a great start to her life, obviously. According to her mom, she went through episodes of self-harm, and at one point in 2002, she was admitted into Friends Hospital for these issues. Now, this was likely a great move on her mom's part. She was trying her best to get her daughter the help that she needed. But Justina hated every second of it. She all but threatened her mom to discharge her from that hospital, even though the doctors strongly advised against it. And in the end, Justina rejected the help that she desperately needed, and her mom was left with no choice but to discharge her, despite the doctor's advice to let her get treated. From there on out, things only got worse. She wrote poems with deeply dark and disturbing themes. She was expelled from school in the 8th grade, and she continued to abuse substances of all kinds. She would attend parties, get her hands on her poison of choice by any means, and she was free-falling into a deep, dark hole, very similar to what Eddie, Nicholas, and Dominique were also experiencing. So this was the girl who was introduced to Jason. And right away, Jason fell head over heels for Justina. Jason had never really been in a relationship with anyone before Justina, and to him, she was the one for him, and Jason was very much in love. They hung out for about a week, and that was when Jason decided to invite her to his parents' home, and to meet his parents and everything. Jason's parents and sister, Melissa, were very excited to see Jason having hard eyes for a girl. They were very interested to meet this mystery girl Jason couldn't stop thinking or talking about, so the date for the meeting with Jason's parents was set for May 31st of 2003. It was a Saturday, and Jason would bring Justina to meet his parents, particularly his mom since the two were very close, and all would hopefully go well. But well isn't the word that I or anyone would use to explain what went down after this, because just a day before Jason was due to bring his girlfriend to his house, he went missing. Normally, Jason's routine went something like this. He'd wake up, he'd eat breakfast, he'd go to work, and if he didn't have any plans, like meeting up with a friend or going somewhere, he'd be back by that evening. It was like clockwork. Jason was very good about leaving and arriving home on time, so when Jason didn't come back home after work on the evening of May 30th, his parents were kind of taken aback, but they weren't all that worried. His parents thought that maybe he was just going through a teenage streak of breaking curfew, seeing if he could get away with it, things like that. But the Sweeney family began worrying when it was almost nighttime and there was still no sign of Jason. Melissa called Jason's workplace and his phone, but he wasn't answering, which was extremely uncommon for him. Where was he? The Sweeney family tried to come up with every logical reason for Jason's silence, but when Monday morning came, they couldn't wait any longer. They went to the police, and they reported 16-year-old Jason Sweeney missing on June the 2nd. So the police came, and they took the report and asked about Jason's description and what he was wearing. The usual questions. When Jason's mom described what he was wearing the day that he was last seen, the officer looked up at her with a very weird expression on his face. It was this mix of fear, surprise, and maybe something else. But what was going on? Well, to find out, I've got to take you back just a bit, back to the day that Jason was supposed to introduce Justina to his parents, May 31st of 2003. Basically, on this day, locals had called the police to notify them about something they'd found at the Trails. This was a wooded and remote area of Fishtown near the Delaware River. The Trails was about a mile away from Jason's home. So the police went out to investigate, and they immediately came across an injured and deceased body. The severity of the injuries proved to be a hindrance for the police, as they couldn't figure out the age of this person. By the looks of it, the male appeared to be in his 30s or 40s, and he had no form of identification on him. He was only wearing a St. Jude's necklace, and he had a cut on his palm. He was wearing a dark-colored t-shirt and jeans. This male, John Doe, was taken away to the medical examiner's office, and since there were no recent missing person reports, there wasn't a whole lot the police could do for right now. That was, until Jason went missing. The police were left gobsmacked at the odds. The John Doe found in the Trails was wearing the same clothes as Jason the day that he disappeared. But John Doe was in his 30s to 40s, and Jason was just 16. But still, the police called the Sweeney family in to identify the body. Jason's parents' worst nightmare became true. The John Doe lying lifeless in that medical examiner's office was none other than their own son. He was identified by that St. Jude necklace, which was given to him by his grandmother. Jason's family couldn't believe this. Who could have done this to him? And why? Now that the police had identified Jason, they knew that someone was behind the attack. It was a very frenzied attack. It was a crime of passion, no doubt about that. Jason didn't just trip and fall in a remote area where he was found. He was attacked. So the police talked to Jason's parents about the people that he hung out with. Any particular and peculiar information that would be helpful to the case, and obviously, if he had any bad blood with someone. The police eventually found out about Jason's friends, Eddie, Nicholas, and Dominique, and his new girlfriend, Justina. They were the last people to have been known to have interacted with Jason. Even though Jason wasn't as close with the trio anymore, he did hang out with them from time to time. And since Justina entered the picture, seeing the trio was kind of inevitable at that point since they'd be at the same gatherings. So first, the trio, Eddie, Nicholas, and Dominique, were called in, and they were all questioned separately. Eddie was questioned by one officer, whereas the Koya brothers were questioned by another. But they didn't know where Jason was. According to them, they were at a party at a friend's house on the day that Jason went missing. And in fact, they were waiting for Jason, but he never showed up. That was it for the questioning. But there was still one person who could recount the details of the day when Jason had gone missing. And that was his girlfriend, Justina Morley. She was his girlfriend, and if anyone knew where Jason was at the time of his disappearance, well, it should be his girlfriend, right? So Justina was called into the police station for a round of questions. And initially, she gave the same story as the rest of the boys. But she couldn't keep up the ruse for too long. The words that came out of Justina's mouth and what she proceeded to tell the police couldn't have been more chilling. In the end, Justina's statement became the missing puzzle piece in this mystery. Justina basically confessed to the police about how she, Eddie, and the Koya brothers were involved in Jason's attack and his subsequent passing. This was a haunting revelation. These were the four people who Jason was closest with. How could they be the ones behind his passing? Were the police really supposed to believe that a bunch of teenagers had targeted their friend like this? And to make things even worse, it was actually Justina who lured Jason into that very place where he was eventually found deceased. So what happened on that fateful day? Well, according to Justina, the attack was planned way before it was set into motion. And what was even worse was that this wasn't the first time that they had thought about this. Their original plan was to lure Jason to the South Jersey shore and attack him after he withdrew some money from an ATM. But that didn't work out for some reason. Then the group thought that Jason's home was the best place to carry out the attack, but again, something happened and the plan was put on hold. Finally, it was decided that the day before Justina was about to meet Jason's family, she would lure Jason to a remote place with the promise of a good time, and the friends would be hiding, ready to jump at the perfect moment. Now, Jason was really attracted to Justina, so this was a dream come true for him. He was quick to say yes, and he didn't have any reason to be apprehensive. He thought the two were truly in love. It was Justina, his girlfriend, the girl that he had a huge crush on and was only a day away from introducing to his family. But Jason couldn't expect that he was walking straight into a trap, and it was set up by none other than the girl that he loved and the people he called his friends. As soon as Justina lured Jason deep within that wooded area, Eddie, Nicholas, and Dominique came out of hiding, and almost immediately, they launched an attack. Jason tried to save himself. He tried pleading, and he tried to make them stop, but in the end, he was unsuccessful, and tragically, Jason Sweeney, who was only 16, lost his life at the hands of the people with whom he'd been close friends with for his whole life. After the attack, the trio and Justina went through Jason's pockets and stole his paycheck for the week. $500, some gum, and some other things. An attack that led to Jason losing his life was for a $500 paycheck. This was all the group wanted. They just wanted his money. And need I remind you, these are a bunch of kids, actual children, teenagers. Well, after their successful money heist, the group celebrated with a group hug and left the scene as if they hadn't literally just murdered their closest childhood friend. They disposed of the weapons, the soiled clothes, and all the other evidence in nearby places. Then they just split the money among themselves. According to Justina, everyone was unaffected, happy even, like they just won the lottery. So what did they do with all this money? Well, they spent it on partying, drinks, and other random stuff along the same line. They literally went partying after committing murder. This is mind-blowing. If this doesn't illustrate the depths people will go to fuel their addictions, then nothing will. But after Justina's confession, the police honestly needed a second to just get a hold of themselves. They didn't expect the questioning to take such a dark turn so quickly. And what surprised the investigators even more was how detached Justina was. Her expression was cold, nonchalant, and you would think that she was just talking about the weather or something boring to her. Well, the police were left shocked. Melissa, Jason's sister, was likely shocked more than anyone else, as she'd also been pretty close with these boys growing up. But this? Well, the investigators now had their guys, but they needed to dig more. Would the boys be as cooperative as Justina? Well, surprisingly, they were. One by one, Eddie, Nicholas, and Dominique spilled everything about how they participated in Jason's attack and what part that each person played. Dominique confessed that in the days leading up to the attack, the group was listening to the infamous Beatles song, Helter Skelter, for over 40 times, supposedly. Also, this is just a side note, but there were also 4 attackers. The Beatles also had 4 members, and if you remember, Melissa said that their family was lovingly called the Beatles by her and Jason's dad because they also were a group of 4 people. The parallels are heartbreaking, scary, and bizarre, all at the same time. Now, you would think that the group's confession would be enough to indict them for murder, but oddly enough, it wasn't. The police needed something permanent, something that could be argued with to successfully take this group of teens to court and punish them. As much as the investigators didn't want to do it, they had to strike a deal with one of the murderers, and they chose none other than Justina Morley. If she pleaded guilty to third-degree murder and testified against the rest of the group at the trial, she'd be given a lighter sentence. Justina happily took that deal. It was a bitter pill for everyone, but the state had to do what they had to do, and it was decided to try the whole group as adults for obvious reasons. Well, Eddie and the Koya brothers were eventually charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, robbery, and possessing an instrument of crime. The trial for Eddie, Nicholas, and Dominique was held on February 28th of 2005, and as promised, Justina testified against them. The prosecution also managed to find the weapons that were used to attack Jason, as well as DNA evidence on some of the recovered items of clothing from the perpetrators. The trial lasted for just 2 weeks, and at every hearing, Jason's family was in the front row, just reliving the pain that their son and brother went through. In no time, the jury deliberated, and the verdict for the trio was guilty. They were found guilty on all charges, and in May of 2005, Edward, Nicholas, and Dominique were sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for the murder of Jason Sweeney, as well as an additional 22.5 to 45 years for conspiracy, robbery, and possessing an instrument of crime. It was clear as day they were never getting out of prison until the last day of their lives. But the fight was far from over. Justina's sentencing was still pending. Because of the plea deal and holding up her end of the bargain, Justina was sentenced to only 17.5 to 35 years in prison. All of them showed little to no remorse. They were not the least bit sorry for taking Jason's life. Well, after 15 years had passed, in December of 2020, Justina Morley was released on parole from prison. She was just as involved in Jason's attack as any other person in the group, and the fact that it's been 5 years since she was released is unbelievable. We don't really know where she is or what she's doing now, but Jason's family, as well as everyone who was involved in this case, they're kind of in disbelief. Jason's family can still feel that void that was left after their son's sudden passing. Jason was just a young man who had so much to look forward to. He was on the right path, he was building his life, he was hardworking and mature for his age, yet he still met his tragic end. The main things that make this case so unique and equally terrifying is A, the age and attitude of the perpetrators. They were Jason's friends. They were just like him, but they didn't even bat an eye when they ended Jason's life. In fact, they thought it was one of the coolest things they ever did. And B, the motive. What's believed to be the primary motive was just money, but also something else too. Something deep-rooted and something resentful. Whether it be jealousy towards Jason, resentment of his having a better life, or some other negative emotion, something other than greed led to this attack. Because even after 2 decades, the pain of losing Jason Sweeney is still fresh in the heart of his loved ones. It's something that they can never forget for as long as they live. They lost Jason so suddenly and inexplicably, and it's a wound that will always hurt no matter how much time passes. I think Psalm 55 gives a very deep insight into cases like this, when David says, "It's not an enemy who taunts me, I could bear that, but it's you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend." David, too, was referring to the deep betrayal of a close friend. Betrayal on its own is hard enough, but when it comes from someone so close, even Scripture recognizes how deep those cuts can really go. But we can't forget how Psalm 55 ends, with David concluding by saying, "But I call to God, and the Lord will save me." He finally adds, "Cast your burdens on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be shaken." She thought she was being pulled over for speeding, but it was the last mistake she would ever make. It was just after Christmas. A 20-year-old college student was driving home at night on a quiet stretch of highway in California. She just spent the day taking care of her sick boyfriend, and she called her parents and told them she was on her way home. But she never made it. Instead, her car was found later abandoned at the bottom of a dark off-ramp, and her keys were still in the ignition. Her belongings were still inside, and her body was discovered beneath a bridge in a ravine. At first, police had no idea who did this, but then something terrifying happened. Women started calling in, saying that they'd been stopped in the exact same place by the exact same man for no reason at all. And the person that they were describing wasn't a stranger. He was a uniformed highway patrol officer. Cara Knott was a 20-year-old student at San Diego State University. She was majoring in education because she wanted to be a teacher. On long walks with her parents, she would talk about graduating, working with kids, and having a family of her own someday. Cara was a gentle, kind, and deeply loved person by everyone who knew her. At the time, she was in a serious relationship with her boyfriend, Wayne Bautista. Their families were pretty close, and they visited each other's homes pretty often, and in everyone's eyes, Wayne was the one. Cara's life felt stable, predictable, safe, and then 2 days after Christmas, everything went wrong. It was Christmas of 1986, and Cara and her family had a wonderful time over the holidays. Everyone was gathered around for a good time, and time flew by. 20-year-old Cara, or really anyone for that matter, never expected that this would be the last happy Christmas that they would celebrate together. 2 days later, on December 27th, Wayne was down with a really bad case of the flu. Apparently, it was so bad that he couldn't even get out of his bed and was at his house with a raging fever. When Cara found out about this, she was obviously pretty worried for him. But this was Cara, always looking out for the ones that she loved and trying her best to be as helpful as possible. So Cara made plans to spend the day with her boyfriend and nurse him back to health. She knew that Wayne was probably feeling pretty miserable and would want someone to be with him, so that was exactly what she set out to do. She told her parents that she'd be spending the day at Wayne's in Escondido, and that she'd be back by the evening. It was a pretty basic and routine thing for Cara to do, so her parents watched her hop into her white 1968 Volkswagen Beetle, and they waved goodbye to their daughter. Now, the distance between Wayne and Cara's homes was approximately a 40-minute drive south on Interstate 15. This is important later, so just keep that in your mind for now. But Cara reached Escondido, and she told her parents that she'd made it by calling from her boyfriend's house. And that was that. Cara spent the day with Wayne, being by his side, helping in whatever way she could, and by the time evening rolled around, it was time for Cara to go home. Now, because this was the pre-cell phone era, Cara called her parents once again from Wayne's house, telling them that she was on her way. This is also something to note about Cara. Now, I'm sure you're pretty tired of hearing this by now, but Cara was pretty punctual. She didn't have any last-minute plans with anyone. And if she said she was coming home, then you best believe that was set in stone. She was going to be coming home. So Cara's parents were expecting her to be at home in about 40 minutes, give or take, but she didn't come back home. 40 minutes passed, then a few more minutes went by, and then it was an hour, and then an hour and a half. Cara's parents were starting to get anxious. Where was she? She should have been home by now, unless she somehow wound up in an accident on I-15. But that also didn't make sense, because Cara was usually the type to let her family know if she was going to be late or if she was stuck with some kind of problem. If there was a payphone nearby, then Cara would have called them by now to let her know why she was late. But that call never came. And with each passing minute, Cara's parents grew more and more uneasy, and they just had a really bad feeling. So when they thought that they waited long enough, Cara's sister Cynthia and her husband, as well as Cara's parents, took their cars and drove down the same route that Cara took to go to Wayne's home. Now, maybe Cara was stranded somewhere, and maybe she needed help. Maybe her car ran out of gas, maybe it was a flat tire. The Knotts family's minds were going through all kinds of possibilities that could logically explain Cara's delay. They drove down the roads. They tried to search for Cara or her white Beetle, but it was nowhere to be found. While searching for Cara on their own, her dad, Sam, also called the police to file a missing person report. But the police pulled the whole wait 48 hours card and left the family helpless and on their own to search for their daughter. Cara's mom, Joyce, made frequent stops at payphones and called up the local hospitals for any casualties or accidents that may have rolled in at that time. They were trying everything to cover their bases and search for Cara, but nothing came up. No one resembling or having Cara's name was admitted to the hospital. No Volkswagen accidents were reported. Nothing. But the Knott family didn't let up. They didn't stop searching for Cara. As cliche as it sounds, this was highly unlike Cara. She was never late. I know you hear about this in true crime cases a lot, but it's a fact for a reason. If someone is inexplicably late to a very important appointment, or they stray from their routine when they normally wouldn't, these are signs that should never be ignored. So the Knott family, and even Cara's extended family, searched all the roads, the dirt paths, the parking lots, construction sites, and who knows where, to look for Cara or her car. The search for Cara was carrying on all night, and it would come to a stop the following morning when her own family made a chilling discovery. On the morning of December 28th, Cara's sister Cynthia and her husband were driving down a remote road when suddenly they hit their brakes. They saw something in the deserted cul-de-sac near the Mercy Road exit of Interstate 15. This was a road that led into a dark, dingy, and remote area of Interstate 15, the same route that Cara took to go to Wayne's. When the couple got closer, they saw a white car. It was Cara's Beetle, and it was abandoned in this remote area. But there was no sign of Cara in or near the car. The car's driver's side window was cracked open, and through the glass, the couple could see Cara's car keys still in the ignition. Her belongings were in the back seat of the car, and a Chevron gas card and receipt were on the passenger seat. The couple knew that Cara wouldn't just leave her car like this in a place that wasn't safe for anyone to be alone at night. So without wasting any time, Cynthia rushed to the nearest payphone and called the police. They alerted law enforcement of Cara's car being found abandoned in that remote area, and they demanded that officers come and take a look around. Well, finally, the police took Cara's disappearance seriously this time, and a car was dispatched to the cul-de-sac to inspect the scene. Now, this place where Cara's car was found was a vast area of land surrounded by thick bushes and trees, and in the distance, there was a 65-foot bridge that overlooked a ravine. The officers arrived at the scene, and a search began for Cara. They also found it weird for her car to be found deserted in such a remote area. During the day, this place wasn't nearly as scary, but at nighttime, you could barely even see where you were going, and there was not a living soul as far as the eye could see. So this was as remote as a place could get in this area. The police also expanded their search to the bridge and the ravine, and that's when they saw something in the water. It was a tinge of purple and white from far away, but up close, it was devastating. The police went down to the ravine and recovered the floating figure in the water, and in no time, Cara's missing person case entered the homicide territory. 20-year-old Cara's body was found in that ravine. The purple and white sight was the clothes and the shoes that Cara was wearing. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this already, but before going missing, Cara was wearing a purple sweatshirt and white leather boots. And unfortunately, when they found her, 20-year-old Cara could not be revived. She was gone, and the search came to a devastating halt. Cara's family and friends were notified of the discovery, and they were shocked and blindsided at the same time. Cara, who was alive, well, and smiling just a few hours ago, was now found below a bridge, left in the ravine like she was nobody. Cara's family's world was turned upside down. They needed answers. They needed to know who had done this to their Cara, who had never done so much as hurt a fly, for that matter. An autopsy was later conducted on Cara's body, and thankfully, there's no evidence of sexual motivation found. But she did meet with a terrible fate, and someone had taken her life with their bare hands and a rope. There were also injuries on her face, as well as defensive wounds and DNA underneath her fingernails, and the police, as well as the entire community, were bewildered. They needed to catch the culprit before they struck again. The police had very few clues to go on in the investigation. I mean, sure, they had DNA evidence, but this was the 80s. Advanced DNA testing was still a foreign concept, and the lack of, or rather the absence of, surveillance cameras also didn't help the police's case. So the investigators did what law enforcement agencies usually did back in the day, and that was set up a hotline for leads. They needed anyone and everyone to come forward with details about Cara, and if anyone had seen anything suspicious on Interstate 15 on the evening of December 27th. Meanwhile, the police traced Cara's movement on that day. She went to Wayne's, and that was confirmed after talking to Wayne and his parents, and then she left. While en route to her home, Cara stopped for gas at a nearby Chevron gas station about 10 miles north just off of I-15. The police talked to the employee working the register at that time, and according to them, they saw Cara pulling up to the gas station, filling up her car, paying for it, taking a receipt, which showed the time of 8:30 p.m., and then getting back on Interstate 15 on the southbound ramp. Now, Cara was making her way home. She was not making any detours. She wasn't going anywhere else. So how did her car end up where it was found? All while this was happening, though, the police also came up with a list of suspects, which was pretty short. But they did initially suspect Cara's boyfriend, Wayne. But he had an airtight alibi, and his reaction genuinely showed surprise and worry for Cara. There was also no reason for him to have been responsible for Cara's disappearance, so he was ultimately ruled out. This also meant that the police were then back to square one. They went through different leads coming from the hotline, and a couple of days into the investigation, several calls from various young women came in. But the weird thing is, all these women were telling the exact same story, and all of these women mentioned the exact same name. The women who called the hotline following Cara's disappearance were all in their 20s, and coincidentally, they all drove the same cars as Cara. Not just similar, but the exact same. All the women had Volkswagen Beetles, and they were all the same model that Cara had. The women also bore a striking resemblance to one another. So this was off to a very unnerving start for the police. If this were truly a case of a serial criminal, well, he had a very specific type. The women told the investigators that they dealt with a very bizarre and uncomfortable situation in the same area where Cara's car was found, on Mercy Road. The women divulged that they'd be driving down Interstate 15 at night and to be stopped by an on-duty California Highway Patrol officer. But what was bizarre was that the officer would make the women pull over at the bottom of a secluded, unlit off-ramp. And also, it wasn't like the women were breaking the law or anything. They were driving under or within the speed limit. They weren't being reckless, they were sober, so they were all surprised when they were stopped by a highway patrol officer. But what could they do? They couldn't just put up a fight with an authoritative figure. They felt that they had to comply. Well, this was when things started to get weird. The officer would then proceed to detain these women for 90 minutes at a time. Not 9, 90. And that too, for no reason at all. Then the officer would poke into the women's personal lives and ask really uncomfortable, out-of-the-blue questions before finally just letting them go. The officer was not threatening, but he would cross the line at times and touch the women's shoulder or hair, which obviously left these women in a state of shock and distress. I mean, can you imagine being pulled over by a CHP officer when you did nothing wrong and having to deal with inappropriate questions and actions for an hour and a half? Well, the police checked in with other people who encountered this particular officer, and all of the women who bore a resemblance to Cara were detained unusually longer than necessary, whereas male motorists were often let go within 5 to 10 minutes of being stopped at the interstate. This was really bizarre, but there was something that led these women, who were also victims in a sense, to come forward. It was a TV segment talking about road safety that was televised following Cara's disappearance. See, 2 days after Cara took the I-15 route to her boyfriend's house and the very chilling discovery of her car and her body, a local news station decided to film a segment with a California Highway Patrol officer for safety tips and what to do when a person gets stranded on the side of the road. The face of this segment was a model highway patrol officer, a 13-year veteran, Craig Payer. He was a middle-aged man who looked safe and like someone you'd run into for help if you got stranded on the side of a dark road. And in this segment, Craig was seen driving down his usual route, Interstate 15, the same route Cara had taken. And he was doing so while talking to the cameramen and giving viewers safety tips to follow on the highway. This segment was all over TV, and all men, women, the elderly, and children saw it, including the women who later called the hotline that was set up for Cara's murder investigation. They had seen this man before, because this was the same CHP officer who stopped them at night for a suspiciously long time and acted unprofessionally towards them. This same creep was now on TV giving safety tips to motorists on the highway. But there was also another thing that a lot of people just couldn't overlook. Craig had injuries on his face. They looked like scratches, and he didn't even try to cover them up. They were out in the open, and even though people didn't think too much of it at the time, now that the police had this new information that Craig, the model CHP officer with a mirror-clean record, had been terrorizing women and making them feel distressed on remote roads of I-15, well, they knew they couldn't let this detail go. So the police looked further into Craig. They basically wanted to check where he was at the time that Cara was also on I-15. And see, an attendant from another local gas station, this one being close to where Cara's car was found, was questioned by police about seeing Craig that fateful evening. And well, this person had seen Craig. It was around 9:30, so about an hour after Cara filled her car with gas at that Chevron gas station. And according to the attendant, Craig looked really nervous and disheveled, and he had injuries on his face, the same injuries he was now sporting on that TV segment. When the attendant made small talk with Craig and asked how his evening was going, he replied that, quote, he had a rough night. Craig's wife also came forward and told the police that she also saw the injuries on his face when he came back home from work that night, and he gave her some sort of vague explanation. Then, discrepancies in speeding tickets raised a lot of red flags for the police. See, two brothers came forward and told the police that Craig had stopped them for speeding and had charged them at around 10 p.m. But when those records were checked, they showed that Craig had scratched off the original time and changed it to 9:20 p.m., giving him an alibi for that evening. It was all really weird, so the police had a strong enough reason to arrest Craig on suspicion. And wouldn't you know, that's exactly what they did. Craig Payer was arrested on January 15, 1987. When asked about the injuries on his face, Craig tried to explain it away by saying that he fell headfirst into a chain link fence, but the police didn't think so. The injuries were consistent with someone scratching him in an attempt to protect themselves. Chain link fence injuries didn't look like Craig's injuries. Ultimately, the evidence against him piled and piled, and the police charged him with the first-degree murder of Cara Knott. Craig's possessions were also confiscated by the police, and in his car, they found a rope and a flashlight, both of which were things used to subdue and ultimately take the life of Cara. It's mind-boggling that Craig still had the murder weapon in his car, and both items turned out to be the ticket to convict him in the end. Also, forensic evidence placed Craig at the scene of the crime, and it pretty much cemented the notion that he was the one to have attacked Cara. His DNA was found on her shoes, and Cara's DNA was found on Craig's clothes and body. Fortunately for the police, Craig had a very rare blood type, AB negative, and it was found on Cara's clothes and body, so there was literally no person involved in Cara's attack other than Craig himself. By January of 1988, Craig's first trial was held, but the result was a hung jury. People at that time just couldn't believe that a patrol officer would be capable of something like this. But after hours upon hours of deliberation, they couldn't reach a verdict. The 12-jury panel deadlocked, with 7 of them voting for the guilty plea. So while preparations for another trial were underway, Craig was free on bail. I can't even imagine how Cara's family must have been feeling about this. It felt clear as day that this person was involved in Cara's attack. And even though he was charged with the crime, the trial ended in just confusion and disorganization. And now he was free and able to hurt other young women until his second trial. But finally, after a few months, that second trial was held. The prosecutors worked relentlessly in this one, and they brought forth concrete evidence, witnesses, and all the things needed to finally convict Craig for his heinous actions. And the trial bore fruit, and the jurors reached a unanimous verdict. Craig Payer was guilty of first-degree murder. But Craig, on the other hand, didn't even speak one word at his own trial, and continued to maintain his innocence until the very end. But finally, on August 4th of 1988, Craig Payer was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years. He's since been denied parole 2 separate times, once in 2008 and then again in 2012. He is still deemed a danger to society, and I'm not arguing here one bit. He's currently serving his sentence, though, at the California Men's Colony in California. His next parole hearing is set for January of 2027, which honestly isn't that far away. And Cara's family, who've been present for every court date, trial, and parole hearing, they want this murderer to never see the light of day again. But what's still unclear to this day is the reason why Craig attacked Cara. He's targeted women in the past and in the same way, but it only escalated to murder with Cara. Since Craig has kept his lips zipped, we really don't know what happened that night that pushed Craig to do the unthinkable, and we might never know. Why, after all this time, this man hasn't explained a single word of this, I really don't know. I guess he's just hoping that at some point, someone on a parole board will believe that he's innocent or something. I don't know. But Cara was just going about her evening, business as usual, and out of nowhere, Craig pulled her over, murdered her, then just acted like the whole thing didn't even happen. It all feels pointless, and I guess because in a sense it is, or it was. Cara's dad, Sam, and the rest of the Knott family even lobbied for the missing person time window to be shortened from 48 hours to help promptly solve these cases quickly and hopefully save other people from the same tragedy that they went through. I don't know whether they were successful in this particular area or not, but I've heard from various sources that most police departments these days, well, they don't even have a waiting period to report a missing person, so maybe in some way their lobbying was successful. But what's so heartbreaking about this case is that Sam, Cara's dad, passed away of a heart attack just a few feet away from where his own daughter was found lifeless. See, the Knott family had set up a memorial, a beautiful oak tree memorial garden for their daughter, and Sam was tending to it when his heart gave out on him. It's a different kind of sad when you think of how Cara's dad lost his life, advocating for the safety of female drivers because his own daughter lost her life at the hands of someone who's supposed to protect the citizens. The family has now suffered 2 losses, all because one rogue highway patrolman just wanted to hurt someone. Most people disappear quietly. They pack a bag, they take their phone, they leave some kind of trail. Kristal Reisinger left everything. Her phone was on the floor. Her medication, the kind she couldn't live without, was untouched. Food was just put in the fridge, rent was unpaid, and her daughter was waiting for her call. And 2 days before she vanished, Kristal told someone about a feeling that she was going to die. Then the town did what small towns often do. They said she ran away. They said she was unstable. They even said aliens took her. Kristal Reisinger was born in Phoenix, Arizona. Very little is publicly known about her childhood, except that it was unstable. Her home life was difficult enough that she was eventually sent to Denver to live with her aunt, hoping for something safer. But that situation unraveled too. When she was just 15, the courts stepped in and removed her from her aunt's custody. That's when she moved in with a friend's family, the Irvins. For the first time, Kristal experienced something that felt normal. Debbie and Rodney Irvin even treated her like their own daughter. They gave her a furnished basement room, encouraged her to finish high school, pushed her towards college, stability, structure, everything. And Kristal thrived. She enrolled at Western State College, where she built close friendships, including one with a man named Michael, whose family also embraced her. But Kristal was never meant to live a conventional life. She was intuitive, spiritual, drawn to energy, nature, symbolism. She studied different religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, native traditions. She read tarot, believed in auras, and described herself as clairvoyant. City life never fit her. Even in Colorado, even with stability, something in her felt restless. During this time, she met Elijah Guana, and their relationship moved quickly. They moved in together, and soon enough, Kristal was pregnant. Motherhood then changed her. When her daughter Kasha was born, friends say that Kristal found a deeper sense of purpose. It was like she too was somehow reborn. But even that didn't quiet the pull that she felt. Denver felt suffocating. Gunnison was better, and she moved there in 2014 for work and classes. But it still wasn't it. Kristal wanted somewhere raw, somewhere spiritual, and somewhere that felt alive. Well, in the spring of 2015, that search led her to Crestone, Colorado. And Crestone was unlike anywhere she'd ever been, but it would also be the place that she would lose her life. Crestone is known as the New Age religious capital of the world. Basically, it's a den of people or truth seekers flocking to this area and finding their purpose, connecting with Mother Nature, and meeting like-minded people. Kristal fit in here. Crestone had a pull on her. Now, Crestone is a very small town, and by small, I mean the population of this town in 2020 was 141 people. And I'm not missing any zeros. This town is tiny. It's basically a melting pot of different religions there. There are temples, Buddhist centers, monasteries, and other sites that make up the rich history of this place. Now, you know what small towns are all about. When there's only 141 people in a small town, you know it's very intimate. Everyone knows everyone. At the time of Kristal's case, there were about 120 or so people living in Crestone. It was really safe and everyone got along just fine. There just weren't a lot of people to have conflicts with in general. Crestone was a place where you could leave your doors unlocked and go to bed without a care in the world. I know most of us won't, but people really didn't think that anything evil resided here. It was the center of many, if not all, religions. Even though the place itself was surrounded by remote sand dunes and there was nothing for miles upon miles, people would still sleep peacefully at night, knowing that nothing could happen. Another very interesting thing about Crestone is that there was a neighboring town called Hooper. Now, Hooper is an even smaller town than Crestone. If you thought 141 was a small number, Hooper's population was a whopping 81. But that's not what Hooper is known for. If you're a fan of alien conspiracy theories and things like that, you might already be familiar with Hooper. But for those of you that don't know, Hooper is home to the UFO Watchtower. It's a place where UFO sightings are often reported. This Watchtower tourist attraction was originally a barn owned by a woman named Judy Meselin. But in 2000, Judy, a struggling cattle rancher, came up with an idea to capitalize on her very barn and turn it into a UFO viewing site, after there'd been many reports of UFOs in the skies. According to Judy, a lot of people would camp out in her barn in hopes of seeing a UFO, without her permission, mind you. So she came up with the idea of turning her barn into a tourist attraction, after getting permission from the county commissioners. Judy would also sell alien merchandise, t-shirts, and it would keep her business afloat. Overall, she saw an opportunity to get her finances back and benefit the city a bit as well, and she jumped on it. The UFO Watchtower is a 20-acre ranch and also consists of a 10-foot-high platform on which visitors can sit, gaze up at the sky, and maybe even spot a UFO or some extraterrestrial being. Apparently in 2023, Judy stated there were 163 UFO sightings reported, of which 27 were seen by herself. And she also did interviews and would host UFO conferences there. Ever since its establishment, over 30,000 people have visited that watchtower. Now, I know you're probably wondering how all of this relates to Kristal. Kristal to Hooper and the spiritual awakening and aliens and UFOs, well, we'll get to that in a moment. But this was the place that Kristal lived close to. And now, if you recall, Kristal, Elijah, and their daughter Kasha were living in Denver before Kristal got the itch to move. Elijah could see that Kristal didn't want to live in Denver. It was obvious, and she was becoming depressed. So he supported her decision to move solo to Kristal. She left Kasha in the care of Elijah, and the two essentially broke up. I'm assuming it was because of the long distance, but the two were still in contact, and they remained really good friends. Elijah was perfectly willing to take on Kasha's responsibility, and he wanted Kristal to be free to do whatever she wanted in Kristal. Since living in Denver had taken such a toll on her, she was now using alcohol as a coping mechanism. So the move to Crestone was not only for spiritual purposes, but also so she could start her journey of sobriety. So Kristal settled in very easily in Crestone. She also got a job working at the local brewing company, and she started playing in a band too. While living in Crestone, Kristal kept Elijah in the loop of things. Even though they weren't together, they still talked almost every day about Kasha and other things. But her move and the happiness that came along with it would be temporary, because in July of 2016, Kristal would go missing. According to Elijah, with whom Kristal shared all of her thoughts and feelings, she had called him before her disappearance. On the phone, she sounded a bit worried. See, she claimed to be a psychic. You know those people that kind of have a sixth sense of sorts, and they know something good or bad is about to happen? Well, that's exactly what she was like, and that phone call with Elijah could only be described as foreshadowing. On the phone, she told Elijah that she just had this really bad feeling that something was going to happen to her, to him, or both of them, and that she was unable to stop it for whatever reason. Elijah was taken aback by this sudden bombshell that Kristal had dropped, but he would be in for a bigger surprise, because a couple days later, Elijah was ambushed by a random stranger to the point of losing consciousness, and he ended up in the hospital with those injuries. Luckily, he made a full recovery, and in fact, Kristal traveled all the way back to Denver to stay with him for a couple days until he got better. She eventually left, but it cemented her suspicions and foreshadowing in Elijah's mind. But soon enough, something would happen to the psychic herself. As mentioned already, Kristal and Elijah talked on the phone every single day. There was never a day that went by when Kristal didn't call Elijah to ask about him and Kasha and other things. But this time, though, Kristal didn't call him. And when Elijah called her, she wasn't picking up her phone. This was really weird. Why would Kristal just go radio silent like that? She'd never done this before. So what was going on? This prompted Elijah to call the police and report her missing after a couple days of not hearing from her. Little did Elijah know, though, that someone else had filed a missing person report for Kristal, and it was, oddly enough, her landlord. But why? Well, back in Crestone, on July 13th of 2016, a woman by the name of Ara McDonald had notified the sheriff's office about her tenant, Kristal's disappearance. See, Ara had told the police a couple days back that she went to visit Kristal at her house because it was rent day. When she saw Kristal at her house, she was immediately worried because she seemed pretty shaken up and stressed. Her clothes were a mess and she was clearly not doing well. When Ara asked what was wrong, Kristal proceeded to tell her that she'd gone out the night before and she believed that someone had drugged her and forced themselves on her. Following the missing persons report, the police went straight to Kristal's home and they gained access. To the investigators' surprise, the home was in ordinary condition. Nothing was stolen, nothing appeared in disarray. It didn't look like Kristal had just packed up and left for somewhere. But Kristal's cell phone was found on the floor of the house. The battery had gone dead and it was presumably abandoned there. The police also found her daily medication, which she couldn't even move an inch without, let alone leave her house to go somewhere else. The police also checked the kitchen and refrigerator, and there was still fresh food inside. The space was well stocked, and that could only mean one thing. Kristal didn't have any sudden plans of going anywhere or leaving altogether. Her phone and important medication were at the house too, but there was no sign of Kristal, and as far as anyone knows, she hadn't contacted anyone during this time. So if she had just restocked her pantry, cleaned up her house, and clearly had plans of staying for the long haul, where could she have gone? The police had very little to go on in this very confusing and bizarre case, and as I said before, these sorts of things don't happen in Crestone. It was a very small, seemingly remote, but relatively safe town. The police weren't experienced in disappearances or any other serious criminal cases. So where was Kristal? This was the main concern for her loved ones and every other person in Crestone, because the news spread really quickly. The only thing the police could do at the time was to retrace her movements from the day before and then check her phone. Also, they wanted to know the reason why Kristal was so distressed the day that she met with her landlady. So where had she gone that night, on an evening that would end up being traumatic for her? Well, the timeline is a bit unclear, but what we do know for sure is that the night before the landlady visited Kristal, she'd gone to a drum circle in Crestone. For those of you that don't know, a drum circle is a type of bonfire party where people make a fire, partly because it's really chilly at night, and they gather around the embers and play these huge drums and sing songs. It's really just a way for enthusiasts to get together, share a good time, play some music, reconnect with nature. Kristal wasn't one to turn down a fun invitation, so she went there. But apparently, her night out did not end well, because someone had extremely nefarious intentions, and they practically forced themselves on an intoxicated Kristal. She was very disoriented after the fact, obviously, and shaken up. She managed to get herself home, but was clearly in distress. And this was the state in which her landlady, Ara, found her. It's such a scary experience for any woman to go through, and it's devastating that it happened at a party where there were a lot of people. But the suspect was never caught, and I also don't know if Kristal reported it to the police. The police thought that this individual might have something to do with Kristal's disappearance. Maybe she threatened to go to the police to report the assault, but she didn't get a chance to do that. The police didn't know for sure. They were just trying to come up with the most reasonable explanation. And then the police talked to some of the people at the party. They wanted to see if anyone had seen the attack on Kristal or the suspect. They just needed clues to tie this mystery together. Well, I don't know if they found something out about the attack or the suspect or not, but they did hear something quite bizarre, and this threw the police off a bit, if I'm being honest. Now, if you remember, Kristal was reported missing by her landlady on July 13th. The people at the party, though, claimed to have seen Kristal at a drum circle on July 18th. This was 5 days since her missing person report and not being in contact with anyone. So did people really see Kristal at that drum circle after her supposed disappearance? This was a really confusing bit of information. And even though it could be chalked up to mistaking a different woman for Kristal, the police couldn't let that slide. They needed to investigate every angle before they could move on to the next. So the next thing the police did was conduct searches. They called in volunteers, people from neighboring areas, and together they searched the vast, desolate, and essentially remote sand dunes of Crestone. There were aerial searches, ground searches, and a whole canine unit that sifted through the different areas of Crestone. The police searched the area where the party was held. They searched far and wide in the areas surrounding Kristal's home and the places she frequented. The police visited her workplace, where she hadn't been seen since July 13th. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation was soon asked to join this case, as it was very complex and bizarre for the police force that didn't deal with stuff like this regularly. But nothing came up. There were literally zero clues as to where Kristal could have gone. The searches were unsuccessful, but they didn't stop. In the meantime, the police had Kristal's phone in their possession, and they decided to go through it. They thought that it might have some important information on it that could lead to some answers. And sure enough, there was one very peculiar detail that stood out almost instantly. It was a call from a number on Kristal's phone. We don't know when the call was made precisely, but this was the last call that came in before either Kristal stopped using her phone or it died. And it was from a man, but he was no ordinary man, at least not in the eyes of the police or the locals. We don't know who this man was, where he lived, or what his name is, but we do know that he was trouble. He was known in the Crestone area as a violent man who had a long rap sheet of spiking women's drinks and then engaging in physical relations without their consent. This man had a criminal history, and he was a danger to women, and his MO was very similar to the attack Kristal endured not too long before her disappearance. There were also numerous reports made by other tenants that strange people were going in and out of Kristal's house. So, are these strange people linked to the man who called Kristal before her disappearance? Based on the available information, this man is the last person to interact with Kristal, so it's not a far-fetched assumption. But questions still remain, like why was this man calling Kristal? How did this man get her number? Was this the same man who attacked Kristal at the drum circle? And is he responsible for Kristal's disappearance? Even though this case took place in such a small community, there are practically no leads. We don't know if the police looked into this mysterious man or if they're still actively looking into the case at all. It shouldn't be too hard since he does have a criminal history. But judging by the progress in Kristal's case and no arrest being made after 9 years have passed, it says a lot. Of course, with any case like this, there is a lot of speculation and theories, and Kristal's case is no exception. The first theory has to do with Kristal being a runaway, and right off the bat, it's unbelievable for various reasons. First, Kristal had a daughter. She had responsibilities. She would never just leave like that because she felt like embarking on some spiritual journey. She would have at least notified Elijah, if not her landlady or her friends. Elijah and Kristal talked on the phone daily about anything and everything, and the thought of just getting away from it all was never mentioned. If this was Kristal's plan, she didn't make it obvious. Also, the state of her house was left in a way that didn't point towards a runaway. She'd stocked food in the fridge. Her medication was still there. She didn't take her phone. Her credit card activity was silent. Many people say this isn't normal runaway behavior. She would have at least taken that medication with her. She couldn't live without it. The second theory, which is the most believable, is that foul play was involved, and the culprit was the mysterious man who assaulted Kristal at that drum circle. The police considered the possibility of him being the same man who called her on the phone too, and he may have threatened her away from reporting him to the police. The police also believe that foul play was involved in Kristal's disappearance, and there are several people of interest, but as of present, we don't know if any arrests or further developments have been made. If so, that information has not been made public. But while we're on the topic of theories, the people of Crestone and Hooper also had a theory of their own, which is unlike any true crime theory you've probably ever heard. Alien abduction. A lot of people believe that Kristal's disappearance was an alien abduction. And because the place where she lived was a famous UFO hotspot, it's not as nonsensical as it may initially seem. But whether you believe in aliens, abductions, or even the extraterrestrial, this case is still mysterious and very eerie nonetheless. We don't know what happened to Kristal that night, where she went, or if she was abducted, and we don't know if we'll ever find out. The police don't believe the alien theory for obvious reasons, and they still think that whatever happened to Kristal was the doing of Earthlings, not intergalactic beings. But the worst part about this case is that Kristal has never been found. She's still somewhere out there, and even though I hate to say it, the chances of finding her alive almost 10 years later, they're not looking good. A $20,000 reward is still on the table for any information on Kristal or a possible arrest in her case, but the investigation was at a standstill for such a long time. But in 2022, 6 years into her disappearance, the police searched a campground outside of Crestone, and there they found human remains. It was a scary discovery, and everyone thought the worst, but the police had an inkling that these remains did not belong to Kristal. Well, they were tested, and sure enough, the remains weren't hers. They were the cremated remains of another person who'd been scattered there by his family. Even though it was relieving, it still didn't lead to any answers for Kristal's case. It was as if she's just gone from the face of the earth, making that alien theory really the only plausible solution at this point. Well, recently, in August of 2025, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation updated the public on their findings. and on August 6th, a search team with cadaver dogs was dispatched to an undisclosed location believed to have been connected to this case. We don't know if the team found anything useful, because they're still keeping the information under wraps, but the call for tips on Kristal's case was renewed, so make what you will of that. I feel like if they found any remains or something like that, they probably would have told the public, so it seems that for now she does still remain missing. There have been no further updates in the case so far, but I really hope that the police find answers for Kristal's daughter, Kasha, who hasn't seen her mom in almost a decade. Kristal was in Kasha's life one moment and gone the next, and she's still nowhere to be found, leaving Elijah and Kasha alone. There's something deeply human about wanting more, wanting peace and wanting purpose and truth. But the dark truth is, not everything that feels spiritual is safe. Not everything that feels enlightened is light. Kristal was just a woman searching for something real. And sometimes, when we search without discernment, we can walk straight into some incredibly dangerous things. That longing, that restlessness, and that desire for something more, it's not wrong. It's human. Kristal just wanted peace. But what she found was so much worse. New friends, new freedom, a brand new life. This was a fresh start for 17-year-old Taylor Behl, but it lasted just 4 days. On the night of September 5th, she told her roommate she'd be back in a couple of hours. She grabbed her keys, walked out of her dorm, and vanished. No calls, no bank activity, no sign she ever made it back home. Taylor thought she was meeting up with someone she knew, but someone else was lying in wait. Taylor Behl grew up in Vienna, Virginia, as an only child raised by her parents, Matthew and Janet. Her parents divorced when she was young, so Taylor learned early how to make her own space in the world. She didn't have siblings, so she built her own circle. She was outgoing, expressive, and constantly documenting her life. She kept a blog where she wrote about everything: friendships, crushes, little victories. If something mattered to her, she wrote it down. Well, in the fall of 2005, Taylor enrolled at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. It was her first real taste of independence. She moved into a dorm, met people immediately, and within days, she was already forming new friendships, including with her roommate, Emma. Her mother later said Taylor sounded genuinely happy on the phone, excited, hopeful, and like she'd finally stepped into the next chapter of her life. And she had. But college isn't just new classes and new friends, it's new freedom. And sometimes, freedom introduces you to people your parents would have never let through the front door. It was the evening of September 5th, 2005, and as the girls, Emma and Taylor, were settling into their dorm rooms and putting all the final touches on their room, Emma's boyfriend paid a visit to them in the girls' dorm. Not wanting to disturb the two, Taylor decided to just step out of the dorm for a bit, so she grabbed her keys and told Emma she'd be back in a couple of hours. Emma vaguely remembers that Taylor wanted to meet up with some friends, but this would tragically be the last time that Emma would see her new roommate. So time passed by, and Emma later got back to her dorm, but there was no sign of Taylor. Her things were left exactly the way they were a couple hours ago, but Taylor was gone. Emma didn't think too much of it and thought Taylor would probably be back at her classes, but she would be very wrong. The next day came, and Emma went to class, and when she came back, there was still no sign of Taylor. Now was the point when she started to worry. Where was she? This was the question going through her mind at rapid speed. Did she just miss the first day of classes? This was unlike her. Taylor, for one, was very excited to start her college classes. She was ready to hit the ground running this semester. But now, it seemed like she not only didn't return home, but also missed her very first class. Emma also checked if Taylor's car was anywhere in the parking lot, but it was nowhere to be seen either. So Emma decided not to wait any longer than she already had, and she involved the campus police and notified them of 17-year-old Taylor Behl's disappearance. A couple of officers stopped by Taylor's door, and they went to see her things and see if she'd taken anything of value with her. Basically, the police initially thought that, say it with me, she had run away. Perhaps she wasn't as excited about college as she showed herself to be. Maybe she just wanted to take a break. Maybe the pressure was too much. But those theories soon died down when the police discovered that Taylor's medication, which she had to take daily, was still in the dorm. Sure, she took her wallet and her car keys, but if she'd run away, as the police had thought, then she would have at least taken her important medication with her. This was non-negotiable for Taylor. The police then searched all over the campus in hopes of finding her, or even just her car somewhere. But the search didn't yield anything. It was as if Taylor and her car vanished into thin air. She also wasn't picking up her phone, and it was just bizarre. Then the police talked to Emma. They wanted to check if she had any idea, even the slightest, as to where Taylor could be at that moment. And she suddenly remembered that Taylor told her right before she walked out the door that she was going to go meet up with some friends, and she promised to be back in that aforementioned couple of hours. Emma told the police everything she knew. She didn't know who that friend was, but now there was a possible lead. These friends of Taylor's might just be the last people to have seen her before she vanished. So the police got to work. But before that, the police notified Taylor's mom back in Vienna. And when she got that call, I'm sure you can imagine her entire world shifted completely. It was supposed to be Taylor's first day of classes, but now she was missing. Janet immediately got into her car and made the 2-hour drive from Vienna to Richmond. And during that drive, Janet basically blew up Taylor's phone. She was hoping and praying that Taylor would pick up her mom's call, but she didn't. Once Janet reached Richmond, she plastered missing person posters for her daughter on every wall, and she appealed to the public to come forward with any information about Taylor. And finally, after 10 days of no contact with her and no leads from the campus police, the case was handed over to the Richmond police. The Richmond police reviewed the case, and they started by checking her bank account and phone activity. Just like Taylor, though, they were radio silent. Taylor hadn't used any of her money or her phone since the day she went missing. And this was alarming. The police also focused on finding her car, and 2 days after the case was handed over to the Richmond police, 12 days following her disappearance, they found it. Her car was found on an abandoned residential street, which was just a couple miles away from campus. They called in a canine unit, as well as a forensic team to examine the car. And even though no such viable evidence was found, a tracking dog led the police to a skateboarder by the name of Jesse, who lived close to where that car was found. The police now had another lead. It was a random man who lived close to the campus, and a service dog led them to him straight from Taylor's car. But what could this random guy have had to do with Taylor's disappearance? Well, detectives were about to find out. So Jesse was questioned by the police, and he was utterly confused. He didn't know who Taylor was, and when the police confirmed where he was the evening that Taylor was last seen, they practically hit a wall. Jesse had a strong alibi for that evening, and he genuinely looked like he didn't have anything to do with the case. Ultimately, he was let go and was no longer a suspect. But that wasn't good for the police, because now they were back to where they had started, with no leads and no clues about Taylor. But they didn't stop there. The police decided to look into the friends that Taylor was due to meet with on that fateful evening. So they checked surveillance footage in the dorms. There was a camera at the entrance of the dormitory, and that finally led them in the right direction. So what did the police see in this footage? Well, a little before 10:30 p.m., a man was seen in dark clothes looking like he was waiting for someone outside the dorms. He looked older than Taylor, and he was seen pacing with his hands in his pockets. Then after some time, he went outside, and then right after that, Taylor followed. The man was definitely connected to her in some way. He was supposedly waiting for her from the looks of it. It was still an assumption at this point, though, but the police decided to look into it further. But remember Taylor's car? Well, the police didn't find anything alarming, but they did find fingerprints on the steering wheel that did not belong to the victim. And when said fingerprints were run in the system, police found a match. It was 37-year-old Benjamin Foley. And if this age wasn't alarming enough, then what made the police even more alert was the fact that he had a criminal record. See, 2 years ago, he was convicted of assaulting an ex-girlfriend. He spent a grand total of 3 months in prison for this felony. Benjamin also looked strikingly similar to the man in the footage. But what was he doing there outside the dorms? And why was he waiting for Taylor? Well, Benjamin was a divorced father of 2, a rookie photographer, and he described himself as a goth skater from the 1980s, whatever that means. Surprisingly, he actually knew Taylor. The two had met some time ago in 2005 before she went to university, when she came to visit Virginia Commonwealth University with her dad at an open house. Well, Taylor ended up staying the night at a friend's apartment, and there she met said friend's roommate, Benjamin, who was also a student at Virginia Commonwealth. According to Taylor's mom, Janet, Taylor and Benjamin ended up getting romantically involved. Now, Janet stressed that Taylor did it purely out of curiosity and that she didn't want anything to do with them after the fact. But some sources report that Taylor and Benjamin, after this encounter, were still in touch via email afterward. Well, Taylor met up with Benjamin again as she got settled into her dorms before she was about to start her classes. Needless to say, the police were floored when they heard all of this. This man was 20 years older than Taylor, who was still a minor at this point. The pieces were starting to fall into place. So the police called in Benjamin for questioning at the station, and as expected, he claimed he didn't know what happened to Taylor that night. According to Benjamin, she'd come to meet up with him. They sat in her car for a bit, which explained the fingerprints. Then they just went their separate ways. He swore up and down he genuinely did not know what happened to Taylor after their meetup. But the police weren't having any of it. Now, sure, they didn't have any incriminating evidence against this guy, but that wouldn't last for too long. The police were granted a search warrant for Benjamin's house, and when they went through his stuff and his electronics, it shocked them to their core. Benjamin owned several weapons, and his computer and hard drives were chock full of inappropriate and explicit adult content involving teenagers. Need I say more? The CDs, hard drives, and every other storage device were labeled with handwriting that matched Benjamin's. It was definitely his property. But in true Benjamin fashion, he denied everything. He put all the blame on his deceased elderly neighbor, explaining that all this stuff was given to Benjamin by that neighbor. This man had the nerve to put all of the blame on a neighbor who's not even alive. Mind you, when Benjamin's own handwriting was scribbled all over the hard drives. It's pretty clear as day. Well, the police obviously didn't believe any of this, and they arrested Benjamin in September of 2005 for possession of this explicit material. Now, all that was left was to figure out Benjamin's involvement in Taylor's disappearance. In case you forgot, Benjamin was a photographer, and he had lots of photos on his computer, aside from the questionable material that was discovered by the police. He had numerous pictures of Taylor, random buildings, and other things too. But you might be wondering why the police were looking into this sea of photos and not asking Benjamin anything about Taylor. Well, Benjamin wasn't spilling anything. He had his lips zipped, and he wasn't talking to the police or giving up any information about Taylor or what happened to her. So the police had some digging to do on their own. And after showing the photos Benjamin took to many people who knew him, one person identified a certain photo. It was Benjamin's ex-girlfriend with whom he'd recently broken up with, and she found a familiar sight in this stack of photos. It was a picture of an abandoned house where her parents once lived in Matthews County. But she was surprised to see the picture of that house in those photos because it was pretty unassuming. But not to the police. They decided to send out a team to search that abandoned house. It was about 100 miles away from where Taylor was last seen, but the investigators had to give it a shot. It was now nearing a month into Taylor's disappearance, and when the police searched the area around the house in Matthews County, they came across a ravine, and they were hit with that strong and unmistakable odor. Things were not looking good. Ultimately, the police made a devastating discovery. As expected, they found remains near that ravine, and from dental records, they belonged to none other than 17-year-old Taylor Behl. Due to the condition of the remains, it was impossible to determine her cause of death. But now, the search for Taylor, it was finally over. But it wasn't a good ending. Taylor, who was just 17, lost her life. And life, as Taylor's parents knew it, was never going to be the same. Following the discovery, Benjamin was now much more cooperative and open with talking to the police. Maybe he knew that he was done for, and he was already in jail for those illegal videos he had possession of by this point, so I'm assuming he was done hiding things. According to Benjamin, Taylor had called him, wanting to meet up. Apparently she'd broken up with her boyfriend, and we all know how that goes. Benjamin claimed that Taylor was upset and very angry when he arrived. I don't know if the police talked to Emma about how Taylor looked and felt that day, but according to what we know, Taylor seemed to be her usual self, so we don't know for sure if this aspect of the story is even true or not. But Benjamin told the police that Taylor came to his apartment and the two engaged in physical relations, but apparently this wasn't enough for Taylor. She and Benjamin then went back to the dorm to get the keys to her car and a few other things because supposedly she had a plan in mind. Now, this was after 10 p.m. If you remember, CCTV footage also showed Taylor entering the dorm and Benjamin waiting for her outside. This corroborated the events. Well, Taylor told Benjamin that she wanted to experiment. Now, I'm not going into any more detail than that. You can fill in the blanks yourself, but the two decided to go to an abandoned house 100 miles away to supposedly act out this fantasy because apparently a nearby hotel or something simply wasn't an option. To keep it PG, Taylor basically asked Benjamin to choke her, but he refused. And after this, she apparently got angry at him and started threatening him. She told him that if he didn't do as he was told, that she would go to the police and tell them everything about him, and about how they'd been together since she was a minor. This put Benjamin in a tight spot, so he felt he had to go through with it. But in the process of playing out this fantasy, Taylor lost her life. Benjamin's actions escalated beyond the point of no return, and naturally, after the fact, he freaked out. He was scared of getting caught, so he needed to think of a plan fast. And what did he come up with? Well, instead of going to the police, he decided the best thing to do was get rid of Taylor's body near the abandoned house and pretend nothing ever happened. He thought that he would escape the consequences unscathed. He didn't call for help. He didn't call the police. He simply got rid of the problem, and Benjamin went on his merry way. He also went on to say that he was under the influence during the act and didn't realize he'd gone this far. He's basically trying to put all the blame on Taylor, who obviously is not there to tell her side of the story anymore, which oddly enough is exactly what he tried to do with his supposed neighbor. Pin his crimes on the deceased because they can't defend themselves. Well, at this point, it was already hard to determine what even happened to Taylor, given the state of the remains. But I don't think Benjamin is really a reliable person to begin with. He continuously changed his story, went back and forth, and like most suspects, refused to take any responsibility for the murder. In Benjamin's mind, it was all Taylor's doing. It was an accident, and he just went along with whatever Taylor asked of him because he didn't want to get caught. Well, the investigators let Benjamin roll with whatever story he was blurting out because they knew he was lying in some way or another. He was going to get tried for murder regardless, so they basically just let the guy talk. But they'd checked every single social media post, every blog entry, and every personal diary of Taylor, and not once was there any sort of blip or inkling that Taylor would have been interested in this sort of thing. To top it off, the police also found duct tape on Taylor's clothes, and this indicated a very dark reality of the whole incident. Even though Benjamin tried to explain the duct tape too by pinning it all on Taylor once again, the police were certain that Benjamin was hiding something, or at least not being truthful about how the events played out. He would change his story every time a new detail was mentioned, and somehow connect it all back to Taylor and claiming it was her own fault. Following this whole scene, Benjamin Foley was charged with the first-degree murder of Taylor Behl, and he was already facing a life sentence for the illegal materials found in his possession. But he decided to take a plea deal. He entered an Alford plea to a charge of second-degree murder. Basically, he knew that the prosecution had enough evidence to convict him, but he didn't admit any guilt for the crime. He showed up to court with photos of his daughters, perhaps begging for leniency, but this was just seen as a sickening move. To use photos of his own daughters as leverage in a criminal case involving a teenager? I can't even wrap my head around that one. This man should never even be allowed near his daughters again, let alone near any woman or any girl ever. Now, this part might anger you, but as part of the plea deal, the life sentence was also dropped, and Benjamin was then given a 30-year prison sentence, meaning he'll almost certainly be let out into the free world again at some point. At his trial, he didn't even address the Behl family or even apologize for what he had done to such an amazing young woman who was just excited to start college. According to Benjamin's attorneys, he was reluctant to accept that plea deal, and he thought very highly of Taylor and never wanted to intentionally harm her in any way. But as we all know, this was likely a 100% lie. Benjamin only wanted one thing from her, and he was determined to get that one thing, one way or another. Taylor's mom, with whom Taylor was very close, since she practically lived alone with her following her parents' divorce, was at the sentencing, and she was incredibly emotional. She was glad that she didn't have to go through a painful trial, but there was nothing the justice system or anyone could do to ease her pain and this immeasurable loss. Janet says she can never truly find closure when she lost her daughter and her best friend, and a person who was so important to her. She does feel extreme guilt that she let her daughter hang out with a man 20 years her senior, and she says this was a painful lesson for her. She pleaded with other parents to be wary of people on the internet, and for people to protect their impressionable kids and who they interact with online, because no one really knows who's present behind the other side of the screen. As Taylor's legacy, her parents advocated for other parents to pull back the curtain and talk with their teenage children like friends, and warned them about the dangers of predatory behavior and the strangers they may meet online. The internet, especially these days, is a terrifying place for children to be. But also, had it not been for the internet and the photos of Benjamin's computer and his MySpace account, Taylor likely would have never been found, and her parents probably never would have been able to say one final goodbye to their beloved daughter. After all was said and done, Taylor was laid to rest the day after what would have been her 18th birthday, on October 14th of 2005. She was an only child, and she lost her life so tragically. We'll never truly know what happened to Taylor on that fateful evening, but the loss weighs heavily on everyone involved. This is yet another case where the internet allowed people to hide their true selves from their victims. And please, if nothing else, let Taylor's story be a lesson to parents everywhere to always monitor your children and what they're doing online. There are so many incredibly terrible people out there just lying in wait for kids who may not know any better. Taylor, unfortunately, wasn't able to make it out, but please, don't let one of your kids end up that same way. On a remote stretch of tribal land, a desperate 911 call cuts through the silence. A young mother says she's stranded. Her fiancé is with her. Their infant son is in the back seat. But then, nothing. Hours later, police find an abandoned SUV, a burned outhouse, and human remains reduced to ash. Just steps away inside a nearby cabin, a man is discovered asleep beneath a blanket, alive, unharmed, beside a boy who shouldn't be there. The woman who made the call is gone. But what happened in those final hours? Why was the fire set? And how did one person survive while another never had a chance? On May 16th of 2020, just before 8 p.m., the Winnebago Police Department received a call from a woman who was obviously in need of help. According to the woman, she, her fiancé, and their 4-month-old infant son were stuck in their vehicle on a muddy road in a remote area of the Winnebago reservation. The police department dispatched 2 Winnebago conservation officers to the site, and they went looking for the people stuck in the vehicle. They didn't find anyone, but they did manage to find an abandoned vehicle, a GMC Yukon. The officers looked inside the car, and no one was in it. It also didn't look alarming from the inside. Everything was normal and didn't look suspicious at all. But the officers still needed to find the 3 people who used to be in that vehicle. So they drove to Walt Hill, but there was no sign of anyone there. The officers then searched and called an end to it when they just couldn't find anyone. A couple hours later, though, a pair of Winnebago conservation officers and firefighters responded to a fire in an outhouse next to a cabin in a nearby area. This area was pretty close to the place where the abandoned vehicle was found. The outhouse was surrounded by bright orange flames, and sadly, there was nothing that could be salvaged. The fire was put out by firefighters, and then when it was safe for entry, officers from the Winnebago Conservation and firefighters assessed the outhouse. When they went inside, that's when they found charred human remains. Very suddenly, things had taken a very chilling turn, and this fire was no accident. It was started by someone, and now, seeing what the officers had discovered, they had an inkling why. And then the officers decided to search the cabin that was right by that outhouse, which was unharmed. They went inside, and almost immediately they found a mattress with a blanket that was draped over the top. When the officers approached that mattress and lifted the blanket, a man startled awake from beneath it. He was unclothed, and before the police arrived, it seemed like he was sleeping without a care in the world. But officers noticed something else too. The man wasn't alone. A baby was sleeping soundly right next to the man. But who was this man, and who was the baby? And whose remains were found next door in that outhouse? What was going on? Well, the police asked the man who he was, and he answered that his name was Jonathan, and that the baby was his and his fiance's, and that fiance's name was Kozee Decorah. Then the police inquired about said fiance. She was nowhere to be found. They knew in the back of their minds, though, that something terrible had likely happened, so the remains were sent away for identification. They were examined by forensic experts, but they were unable to determine a definitive cause of death. The embers had erased almost all traces of evidence and all clues. The remains had to be identified through dental records, and when the results came out, the remains belonged to none other than 22-year-old Kozee Decorah, Jonathan's fiancé, the same man who was found sleeping with his baby in the cabin right next to the alight outhouse. The police were left shocked. If Jonathan was right next to Kozee, then why didn't he do anything to save her from that fire? And where were his clothes? Kozee Decorah was a 22-year-old woman of the Ho-Chunk tribe, living in Wittenberg, Wisconsin, and she was the youngest of 6 siblings and belonged to a big, loving family. The people of the Ho-Chunk tribe are known as the People of the Big Voice. They belong to the Siouan-speaking tribe, established in Wisconsin during the French contact back in the 1630s. The Ho-Chunk tribe has various origin stories. Some suggest that the tribe migrated to the Midwest from the eastern coastline back between 800 and 1200 AD, coming from the Ohio River, while others theorize that the tribe migrated from the lower Mississippi River Valley and then called Wisconsin their home in the 1500s. But whatever it was, by the 20th century, people of the Ho-Chunk tribe were living in Wisconsin as well as Nebraska. So this was the very tribe that Kozee belonged to. Her dad had passed away back at an early age, so she was largely raised by her mother and the rest of the tribe. Kozee was also very religious, and a person who had a contagious laugh, and she was also fond of dancing and running. Overall, she was just a free spirit. After graduating from high school, Kozee moved to Nebraska, but after this move, she began to have issues with alcohol addiction. Now, we don't know the timeline of when all of this took place, but what we do know is that at the time of today's case, Kozee had been sober for quite some time and was well on her way to turning her life around. Soon enough, Kozee met a man by the name of Jonathan Daniel Rooney, who was from Winnebago. We don't know when the two got into a relationship, but what we do know is that Kozee ended up getting pregnant, and the two welcomed 3 children, the youngest being a 4-month-old infant. They named their children Mila, Kyson, and Titus, but the relationship between Kozee and Jonathan was, well, anything but perfect. The two were initially fine, but then Jonathan started to control Kozee. He was very manipulative, physically and emotionally abusive, and pretty volatile. He even threatened to seriously harm Kozee at one point, and it was not a secret to Kozee's friends and family that she was in an abusive relationship with Jonathan. I'm assuming that it was during her relationship with Jonathan when Kozee's mental health started to derail, leading to her addiction. But this is honestly just purely a guess on my part. This information was never publicly shared. But even though the relationship was not ideal, Kozee and Jonathan still continued to stay together, and they even got engaged. Truth be told, Kozee's life was taking a downward spiral until her kids came into her life. And that was when she was struck with motivation to pick herself back up and try to turn her life around. And in Kozee's own words, her children were her savior. Kozee was living in a very depressing state at the time. But when she became a mom, it was as if she had a renewed purpose in life. She couldn't ruin her own life when she had her kids to look after. And if Kozee was anything, she was a loving mother. She hoped to change herself for the better, for her children's sake. Now, at the time of today's case, Kozee was living in Nebraska, whereas her kids were with Jonathan. I'm assuming because of Kozee's crisis, the children were left in Jonathan's care when Kozee was getting back on her feet. And this was likely a very eye-opening moment for Kozee. So she worked to pull herself out of this rut, and her family and friends were there for her every step of the way. And finally, in May of 2020, Kozee celebrated her 3-month sobriety mark, and she was making plans to go back to Wisconsin to get her kids back. She was doing better, and now she wanted to continue being a good mom to her kids, fulfill their wishes, and actually be there for them. But she wouldn't get to do that, because now she was found in a burned-up cabin, and her kids were left without their mom. After the discovery and identification of Kozee's remains, the police broke the news to her family, and they were floored. Kozee was getting her life back on track, and she was ready to take her kids back and was in the process of going back to Wisconsin to reunite with her children for good. But now, this happened. And she was with Jonathan, and he, on the other hand, was found relatively unharmed. Kozee's family was devastated at this news and probably a bit suspicious. The police were also confused about this whole scene. Kozee called 911 a couple hours just before she was discovered. But why did she call 911? Was she actually in trouble back then? And was their car really stuck in the mud, or was it something else? Only Kozee and Jonathan knew the answers to those questions, and tragically, one of them was no longer here to tell their side of the story. So the police investigated the cabin and the outhouse further, and they took Jonathan in for a round of questions. When the officers entered the outhouse, which was now burned up pretty badly, they started to look for things that could link to what happened to Kozee just hours ago. Well, they found some pretty odd things from the get-go. First, by the side of the fire, the police discovered some weird stains on the floor, and there were some disturbing droplets of red. The police immediately took note of this detail because this was not ordinary at all. Then the police also discovered a red mark by a gas grill that was similar to a handprint. We don't know whose handprint it was or whether it was tested against Jonathan or anything like that, but it was still alarming regardless. We also don't know if the police found any evidence of an accelerant being used in the fire. Still, the police carried on with their search. They flipped the entire outhouse and cabin upside down, but they couldn't find one single thing. And it was a very important thing: Jonathan's clothes. They found it to be really weird that Jonathan was found practically nude by the police. Where had his clothes gone? Why did Jonathan presumably get rid of them? Well, this was something that only Jonathan could answer, so now they turned their sights on him, hoping that he'd be the one to blow the case wide open and explain everything. But what Jonathan had to tell the police was anything but what they expected. Right off the bat, the police were highly suspicious of Jonathan. They also did a bit of digging into his personal life and his relationship with Kozee, and they didn't find anything promising. It was just one red flag after the other. The abusive nature of the relationship, the physical violence Kozee endured, her crumbling relationship with Jonathan, and then her moving to Nebraska, all of it just rubbed them the wrong way. And then the investigators noticed that very crucial detail. It was on Jonathan's body. Jonathan had injuries on his right cheek and on his left shoulder, and either what looked like a bruise or a red stain on his arm, and he couldn't explain any of these injuries. They were consistent with a struggle, and judging by what the police walked into at that outhouse, the pieces were starting to fall into place. Jonathan told the police that on May 16th, he and Kozee had plans to attend a ceremony at the Native American church on the Winnebago Reservation in Nebraska, and had gone to that remote place to collect some wood for the ceremony. As they were doing their work, that was when the couple got into an argument. Apparently, it was about Jonathan using illegal substances. I'm guessing that this was also one of the many reasons for the rift and the tension in the couple's relationship, but I'm not 100% sure on this. But Jonathan then told the police that Kozee got physical with him, and then proceeded to kick him out of the outhouse and then shut the door. This was why Jonathan was found in the cabin sleeping on the mattress. According to Jonathan, he didn't know what had happened, and he claimed that he'd been drugged and framed for Kozee's attack. But by who? We don't know. Also, this feels like a pretty major leap. It's a pretty big assumption to just immediately jump to, I was drugged. So the investigators decided to probe for more details. They straight up asked Jonathan if he felt that things had gotten out of hand that night, and Jonathan did admit that he felt, quote, backed into a corner by Kozee and her behavior. Whatever that means. And after this, Jonathan stopped cooperating with the investigators altogether, and he asked for an attorney, which was pretty much the end of the interview for now. Soon enough, the FBI also got involved in Kozee's case, and an evidence report revealed that inside the abandoned vehicle, which was found a good distance away from the outhouse and the cabin and the reservation, was a gas can and a chainsaw. "25-year-old Jonathan Rooney was arrested on June 1st, 2020, almost 3 months after Kozee's untimely passing. He was charged with second-degree murder, manslaughter occurring in Native American country, and destruction of evidence. Jonathan pleaded not guilty to all the charges, so now he was in jail awaiting trial. The federal trial was initially scheduled for May 10th of 2021, but it was pushed back to August 16th, and Kozee's family and loved ones made it a point to attend every single hearing, no matter how painful it was. Kozee's sisters were also present at the trial, since they were all older than her and they felt it was important for them to just be there for Kozee and help fight for her justice. The trial was mostly focused on how Kozee was attacked and Jonathan's involvement in that attack. The prosecution presented its arguments first. And according to the prosecution, Kozee was attacked by Jonathan in the outhouse following an argument. We don't really know what that argument could have been about, but it got out of hand and Jonathan saw no other way but to attack Kozee. He then fatally injured her, got rid of his clothes, and then set the outhouse alight to get rid of Kozee and any evidence. It's believed that his and Kozee's 4-month-old son was the sole witness to this attack, which is a harrowing detail to reveal. The prosecution also stressed the history of violence in Kozee and Jonathan's relationship, and they felt that the argument that the couple had that fateful evening was the straw that broke the camel's back, and that was what led to Jonathan acting on his plan. On the other hand, the defense thought that Kozee's passing was her own doing. And yes, you heard that correctly, the defense actually suggested that Kozee might have been the one to cause her own demise. The defense argued that the evidence found in the outhouse and the car was purely circumstantial, and there was no reason for Jonathan to drive Kozee to her end. The defense painted Kozee as someone who frequently had dark thoughts about ending it all, and this might have been the reason that led to that tragedy. The defense also stated that just because Jonathan was there doesn't mean he was the perpetrator. And they also didn't take Jonathan's history of violence and abuse into account. They just disregarded all that altogether. Now, we don't know if Kozee ever made an official complaint about Jonathan's violence. It's only Kozee's friends and family who claimed that Jonathan was volatile and physically violent towards her. But the defense couldn't really explain Jonathan's missing clothes, the disturbing red stains found in the outhouse, and Jonathan's injuries. So there's that. The trial ended with both sides presenting their arguments, and at the end of it, the 12-person jury deliberated for a full day before coming to the verdict that Jonathan Rooney was found not guilty of second-degree murder, but he was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter as well as destruction of evidence. The sentence for the manslaughter charge was going to be a maximum of 15 years, and along with this, convicted felons may be given a maximum fine of $250,000 and a 3-year term of supervised release, whereas for the tampering of the evidence, the penalty was up to 20 years. Well, Jonathan's sentencing was held on March 11th of 2021, and he was given a collective sentence of 25 years in a federal prison, which Kozee's family felt was not near long enough for the damage and grief that Jonathan caused the Decorah family. Kozee's friends and family even reached out to the U.S. Attorney's Office to call for harsher punishment for Jonathan. Her family rallied for fair treatment in the court of justice, but in the end, 25 years was all he got, whereas Kozee never even got to live to see the age of 25. Even though the perpetrator was behind bars, the Decorah family took it upon themselves to fight for justice for other Indigenous women, including their own petition to modify Jonathan's charges and have him retried for more serious and harsh penalties. A Change.org petition was filed by one of Kozee's family members, which has since received over 14,000 signatures as of present, and in the petition she requested assistance to press harsher charges on Jonathan. Some of these suggested charges include premeditated murder, second-degree murder, felony child abuse, illegal possession of firearms, obstruction, kidnapping, and willful destruction of evidence. Stacy also pointed out different aggravating factors that make Kozee's attack and the crime that Jonathan committed punishable by death. According to Stacy, 9 such factors make Kozee's attack so much more heinous. And to explain what she's really getting at here, just take a listen to this. So, number 1, the murder was committed in an effort to conceal the commission of a crime, or to conceal the identity of the perpetrator of such a crime. 2, the offender knowingly created a great risk of death to multiple people, Kozee and their son. 3, the murder was committed knowingly to disrupt or hinder the lawful exercise of a government function or the enforcement of laws. So you can see, given all these statements, they're not technically wrong. Jonathan did in fact do all of these things and thus could possibly be eligible for the death penalty. But Kozee's case isn't the first or last on the list of attacks against Indigenous women. There were many women before her, and likely will be many women after her, who meet the same tragic end, and in many cases, justice has been delayed, insufficient, or completely absent altogether. Many MMIW activists took their protests to the streets as well as television, and expressed their concerns about the judicial system for not giving these women and their victims fair justice. The point is, the perps are in plain sight, but somehow they're never caught, and this is what leads to dissatisfaction in the end for all of these grieving families of Indigenous women. Many people seem to blame the natives for their own suffering, claiming that their tribes make it incredibly difficult for police to do their jobs correctly, claiming that the leaders of those tribes and the police just keep stepping on each other's toes, so the local police just opt out entirely, leaving so many of these cases unsolved. Now, whether there's really any truth to that at all, I really have no idea, but both sides, they just want to blame the other. But on June 16th of 2020, a huge flock of women gathered outside the federal courthouse in Omaha. They stood there with posters in hand and slogans blasting through megaphones. Chants of "Justice for Kozee" and "No bail, keep him in jail" reverberated from the outside all the way to the inner rooms of the courthouse. As someone who has threatened Kozee so many times and was physically violent towards her, it seems likely Jonathan couldn't keep his anger in check that night. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are upset with Kozee staying with Jonathan for as long as she did, and even having kids with him and getting engaged to him. But what you have to understand is that domestic violence and abusive relationships, they're never easy to unpack or take apart. It's really easy to say that a victim should just leave an abusive relationship from a distance, but it's never black and white. Victims in abusive and volatile relationships are torn down, brainwashed, and manipulated by the aggressors to a great extent, just like Kozee was. They can get further trapped in the relationship when the aggressor tries to tie them down, either with children, marriage, or even a simple engagement. Kozee had children with this man. She couldn't just walk out the door like it was nothing. And Jonathan was successful in keeping a grip on Kozee. Even if Kozee didn't want to come back for Jonathan, she had to for her kids. Things for Kozee were finally looking up when she fought her demons and was waiting to be reunited with her kids. She was finally taking control of her life, and perhaps Jonathan didn't like seeing that. He wanted Kozee to remain under his control forever, and when she resisted, he ended her life. Kozee's attack has many possibilities. It could have been premeditated, because how does one explain the gas can and the chainsaw in the car? And Jonathan's clothes? Why did he get rid of them? It's strongly believed that the clothes were destroyed in that fire intentionally. A person doesn't just strip off their clothes and burn them or lose them in a remote area unless there's something they don't want other people knowing. Also, the call that Kozee made to 911, that was bizarre in itself. But some of the unanswered questions that we all keep asking are, was the DNA in the outhouse tested? Was the chainsaw tested for any DNA? What was the motive? What happened that led Kozee to call for help in the first place? And did someone hear or see anything during that time when the car was discovered and that fire was reported? Yes, it was a remote area, but there could have been something, anything, that could have led to some answers. There are just so many things that could have gone one way or the other, but one thing is for sure, Kozee's passing was not her own doing. It just makes zero sense. I don't even know how the defense thought that this was a good enough reason to defend Jonathan in court. But the truth is, Kozee was looking forward to the changes in her life. She couldn't have possibly taken such a drastic step. I just hope that Kozee's family is doing okay, especially after losing their loved ones so suddenly and inexplicably. I just hope that they can channel their grief into a greater cause, because this was all incredibly disturbing. And it's high time that the attacks on these Indigenous women are taken more seriously.